Yes. Yeah, so the agenda today was mainly proposed by Sebastian. Thank you for that. And yeah, it's basically to discuss the roadmap for this year, 22.
Yeah, basically part of the roadmap, I guess. So only documentation block.
Yes, indeed. So do you want to lead this discussion, Sebastian?
Yeah, I'll do so.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Yeah, this originated from our thread in the discourse about what goals do we want to have for 2022, and a lot of requests were actually about having better discussion, basically for everything which touches Fortran. So having better tutorials for the language itself, having better tutorials for the tools. So I figured we could start with a few points which are more or less easy for us. So like looking into writing tutorials for tools we are maintaining, writing guides for some packages we have in the Fortran-lang namespace. Maybe improve the standard lib documentation and see what we can do with our learn category of the web page. And as a starting point, I would suggest to take something that what we already have, like the FPM documentation, which we did last year, and see which parts of those of this infrastructure can be used to make it easier to write documentation. I mean, writing documentation is still a huge effort, but I think at the moment there might be some problem with participating in this, so having the community participate. For example, if somebody wants to write a guide about standard lib, there is no real place where this can be contributed. And I think we have to start by creating such spaces. I mean, also, of course, there would be the web page for learning, but if you compare the learn page, let's take the quick start guide for this, and then compare it to something like a tutorial we have for FPM. So the look is, I guess, somewhat different. Can't really put my finger on it, but I kind of liked the way the swings was styled better than we have with our Jekyll template. So questions, what would be our next step? So would we try to move the standard lib discussion into a similar framework like we have now with FPM?
Yeah, so Sebastian, to understand what you did for FPM, so there were also specs like in SDB lib, right? Then what did you do to move that to those things? I have no idea, to be honest.
I mean, what we have originally was this documentation we generated with Fort.
Yes, right.
This is basically the same we have for standard lib. So this one was taken from the standard lib, and then we started writing things for FPM. Then, of course, this is suitable if you're a developer. Then this will help you a lot learning about FPM, as well looking into the code. But if you're a user and you arrive on this page, I think this doesn't really help you at all. And I guess we put the packaging and contributing here. And then if you're searching, then you will find the manifest reference. Here's also the packaging guide, which we had. And then you get one guide. But this is, so apart from there's some formatting issues here, this is kind of hidden.
Yep, I agree.
And I mean, we get the same thing with standard lib. If you go here, then you will arrive at this page. Then of course you find the specs, but I think it's not clear that if you go to the specs that you might also find examples how to use this. So this sounds more like something a developer would look like who wants to maybe maybe implement standard lib if you look for specifications. And also this is not really, from this resource, it might be hard to figure out how to get started using standard lib or how to install it on your system. So if you think about the average user who just wants to use standard lib and arrives at this page, I don't think they will find what they are looking for.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So when you have this fourth website, what do you need to do to move it to the other one, the FPM example?
So what we did basically was create a completely independent documentation which covers tutorials, recipes, which are kind of bound to the project, but don't necessarily have to live together with the source code.
Yeah.
The Fort documentation is still there, but it's hosted differently and just linked. So and if you're looking for the reference here, then you can you're able to find it in the AP documentations for FPM. Of course, for standard lib, we might have to get this a little bit closer. But maybe a link will be sufficient as well. So the structure is there. I think we could create something similar for standard lib. And another great thing which I found really important is that we actually can support a multilingual page. So if you look here, then you can basically change the language. And we have a couple of translations now. And if you navigate through, you can always change. And I think this is really important that we are supporting an international community, because there's a lot of interest of producing localized content. And also, while not many people feel confident to contribute to standard lib or FPM, because they think they are maybe not yet ready or good enough in Fortran, there's one's own language is something where one is really confident about the own skill level, and translating a tutorial in one's own language is a much easier way to start contributing to a project than doing something new. And programming languages might be not feel completely familiar. And if you look on the number of translations we already have, I think this is quite a success. We need this for FPM, we need this for standard lib, and I think we need really for the web page itself. But I'm not sure how to do it for the web page, honestly. So if there are any ideas.
Definitely be in favor of transitioning the standard lib documentation to look like what you've done for FPM. That looks really, really good and well organized. The next question would be, would it make sense for the Fortran-lang website itself to use the same template, the same templating engine?
it could. Well, the problem is with strings, you will get something that looks like documentation. I think Martin last time showed me the page they did for Damask, where they start from the PyData theme. And it was okay. However, I don't think you can completely get away from the original layout, where you can actually see that this is not meant as a web page, but as a documentation. And maybe this is not this is the look we want. Maybe this is something we want to avoid. I don't know. If we are happy with having this overall layout, and then it's probably doable. Other thing which I'm more concerned about is transitioning the whole web page at once will be a huge effort. The question is whether there is a possibility to transition in parts. Let's say we only transition the learn category. And we just have to translate all the books which we already have. Question is whether we can do this with keeping the same URL. And we have to do two workflows in the same repository, which might work. But we have to check how this can go.
Could also maybe use a subdomain for the transition.
This could work as well. And we just
like instead of /learn, it goes to learn dot or something like that.
But they're both completely static site generators, right?
Yes.
So
we could
in
just
theory,
run two.
You could just run two static site generators and make
Yes.
sure all the content goes in the right places. But somebody'd have to play around with it and make sure that will work out okay.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I don't know how many of you already have looked into the FPM documentation. This is using a dialect of Markdown, so it's not really Markdown which we're using. Question is whether it's okay.
Markdown doesn't really have a standard, so any dialect of Markdown is a dialect of Markdown, right? So the question is, how different is it that anybody might be confused when they come to help contribute?
I mean, I can give you an example. So if you go through FPM documentation and look at the tutorial, let's say hello FPM, then it's going to look like this. So in the preview.
Right.
And this looks okay. This is more or less what you would expect. And you might see something which looks strange like this. And if you now go to something like the main page, then this won't be in any way meaningful displayed. This is
right, because it's using some extensions or flavor of Markdown that isn't exactly what GitHub expects and knows how to render.
Yeah, so we kind of have to get away from the expectation that our Markdown can be rendered by GitHub. If this is okay, and we expect our users to download the Swings toolchain and work with this locally and look to preview there, I mean, you can look in the raw. This still looks readable. But you won't be able to display it with a normal Markdown reader. This is kind of the drawback.
Well, I mean, it's a similar drawback to writing Ford documentation, right? Ford can render Markdown, but it's got some extensions that GitHub doesn't know how to render correctly. So just about any documentation that we're going to write is going to use some extensions for Markdown that GitHub isn't going to render correctly.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
These Markdown codes. Suppose you translate a page, then you can just take the English version and insert your own language in that. and don't touch the codes, or do you have to be careful about that as well?
It actually works quite nicely. It uses get text, so we're using the standard internationalization toolchain, which is supported. I can show how this is working. So you will find there's a locale directory, and then there are the different languages with the localization messages. And you go here, then you find this PO files, the standard format for the get text. And if you check out this file, then you will find there's like the string in the original language, and then you enter your translation. And if you don't enter a translation, then the original is used.
Okay.
And there's quite a good tool chain built around those PO files. There are a couple of editors where you can actually load this file and edit it interactively in a GUI. You can edit in an editor, a terminal editor. Vim and Emacs have support for those. I think this is the best we can get.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about translating this into Dutch. Probably not the most used language in the Fortran community, but still, it might be worthwhile.
Yeah, much appreciated.
Yeah, but I would hate to have to learn to use all the right markdown things.
But in this case, you only get the strings which come from the documentation. You don't have to use any markdown.
Okay, I understand. That's fine with me. And this way we can do all the documentation?
I think we can do all the documentation except for the automatic Ford documentation.
Right.
And this would be the only part which we leave up to Ford.
Yeah, but I would imagine that the documentation of the API and the internal structures and that sort of things, that's for developers, and then they have already been introduced to Fortran itself. And I would guess that it's less important than that it's localized. And at least it would be a very large effort to do that.
Yeah, I think the more important piece would be that we have a standard lib documentation and that we can write tutorials and localize those.
Yes, well, tutorials, I agree. But having all the documentation, also the system documentation in the various languages, that's going to take a lot of effort, and also to keep it up with all the languages. I
mean, this is actually a good thing, because if there is a community interest in this language, they have an easy way to contribute. And we can do this translation incrementally. So if it's not translated, it will be displayed in English.
Okay.
So I think we can gain a lot having this support.
Yes, most likely. And there's a question, for example, if you change something in the index page in the English version, is it automatically translated in the other languages, or do you have to do it yourself? Or?
Well, what happens if you change something is that the message string changes, and then you won't find the translation anymore. You can update the translation files, and if the sentences are similar enough, then it will find the matching one. And then it will also mark them with fuzzy that found those are likely to match, but they should need a review. And then one translator has to check those again and fix up the translation. So basically, if you break it, then it goes back to English.
Yeah. So it means that some maintainers must be there for every language. That you just No,
Sebastian, regarding transitioning the Fortran-lang.org to Sphinx, which I like the idea, but you mentioned while all Sphinx websites look like docs. So I see there are many themes for Sphinx. From your experience, is there a theme that's somewhat close to a more website-y or landing page kind of look that we could perhaps customize for our needs? I assume every theme comes with a set of CSS that we could perhaps modify just for these. There's several pages on the Fortran-lang.org website that are somewhat different from a docs website, but otherwise, I mean, this Sphinx supports newsletters, blogs, just like you have it on FPM docs. So I think it's really only a limited, a subset of the website that would be somewhat different from that format.
Yeah,
do you think this is feasible?
Yeah, this is, I think, possible. We can write our own Sphinx templates and use those. We can also add our own CSS. Still, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's I don't think it's impossible to do. So there will be some way, but it's just going to take a lot of effort. So starting with the obvious part, I think translating the books would be a good first step, because there it's easy. And then we kind of have to think about, we have a lot of data in there, which we have to read from a file and then insert into the final documents. So if you think about the learning resources or the package index, this is a YAML file. This has to be read and then has to be transformed. We're doing this over a template, and we can do so in Sphinx as well. But we have to figure out how. So this works under the hood with distutils. And I have tried to look into this. There's some resources. I found the documentation there's a bit lacking. At least I couldn't find a good entry point to just get it done. Probably needs, there's some steeper learning curve to do it properly. The alternative, of course, is just to do make external script, read the YAML file, transform it to Markdown, and then read it in. But the proper Sphinx way would be to have something like a Sphinx extension, which transforms this data into distutil nodes and then renders them. But this turns out to be a bit more involved, and I didn't spend too much time on this yet.
In the email, you mentioned this season of docs from Google. Would it be a good candidate for that? Especially for Fortran-lang.org? Maybe not the SDB-lib, but Fortran-lang.
I think this would be either a good Google Summer of Code project to get our web page infrastructure working with this. I mean, there are probably a lot more developers around which are familiar with Python and can figure out how to tweak Sphinx to do what we want for our web page.
Yeah. So I mean, because it seems to be more difficult for Fortran-lang.org. So if it could be done within a season of docs, if you are lucky, so we could focus ourselves on the SDB-lib, and that would be a good thing, I think, instead of trying to do everything in the same time.
Yep. So getting some support there, and maybe involving contributors over these programs might be a good opportunity to move this forward. So I think anyway, all the steps we're doing toward those goals, what we should try is to create a framework to enable the community to contribute more easily and in more ways.
Yes, I agree. And yeah, especially for SDBlib, I think it's now at the stage that it should be used by more users to be more popular, and a better website for the user perspective would be good.
I have a question about SDBlib user docs. What do they look like? The obvious one is, okay, how to install, how to get it as a dependency for your project, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to using SDBlib, what's the format or approach or style that we could take? Is it building some kind of toy project with SDBlib, or is it kind of, going down the grocery list of everything and focusing more on examples rather than the API?
Well, I would say both. We need both. So if you're looking for something specific, you want to have a recipe. You want to get something done. And if you just want to learn about standard lib, then we need a tutorial where you walk our user through.
I think where the majority of the benefits for stdlib documentation is going to be kind of like how-tos, which is kind of like coming up with examples that the different features of stdlib make easier, right? So like, for example, the sorting algorithms that we've added, right? Come up with some sort of example problem where, oh, I needed to sort these things. Here's how I use the sort routines in stdlib to make this easier for me. Because standard lib is mostly just a collection of things that aren't all necessarily directly related. It's basically just a bag of tools that one should be able to pick up.
Yeah. So you would need examples, but I guess also some kind of documentation of the different API and
Mhm.
and yeah, options.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, the API documentation for standard lib takes a very much more prominent role than something like FPM.
Yeah, most likely. And I believe that Milan already started to modify that, or to do some proposition to make it more readable. Because now, yeah, as we started the API, it was mostly focused on the Fortran standard. I agree, it's not really readable for the user. So, but there has been already some discussion also to optimize that, mainly led by Milan.
Yeah, that's still at the stage we discussed last month. Basically, write a template for a current format, and then look at what could or should be changed.
Yeah, so that could be also reinvestigated in the light of this thing stuff, I guess.
So we are looking at at least two levels of documentation there. Getting started guide, and then something about how to use it with a number of examples. The current documentation is, of course, the API itself. They will provide all the details you really need at some point, but the two levels above that, those are the ones missing, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, should we make a schedule for people to work on something like that? I mean, if more volunteers turn up, they should be doing different things and not work on same subjects.
Yeah, based on the complexity, I would start with SDB-lib and then yeah, with the help of Sebastian to organize everything. Then we need to find volunteers to, yeah, for example, to write some tutorials and some examples.
Yeah, I think I can start like I did with the FPM docs and with a separate repository and build everything up until it looks more or less complete. And then we can see how we move forward. One thing we should look into, we should move where the standard lib documentation lives. Because the standard lib docs repo would be where the future source code of the documentation lives and not the output. And I think we should do it similar like we're doing it with FPM and just move it to the GitHub Actions branch in the standard lib repo. We wouldn't change anything because we can still keep the CNAME stuff. But then this repository is free for future changes.
Yeah.
And I would prepare this so we have something to get started and the automation in place. And then we can go from there.
Yeah, looks good. Just one question: is not too large to keep in the branch?
One thing we can do, which I do for the FPM docs repository, is to not make it a branch, which is continuously updated, but which is replaced on every push. So if you clone the repository, it's just a shallow clone, basically, of the documentation.
Okay, yeah. Good.
And then, I mean, I don't really think there is value in keeping the history of the deployed documentation. So if we just always make it a new orphan commit, then this wouldn't really matter. And also keeps the size down, so you don't have to track all the huge diffs in the HTML files in the repository if you clone it.
Yeah, I think it's a good strategy. Yeah, so Sebastian, could you start that? Is that already? I didn't check. Is that already a GitHub issue to that? Because then maybe it would be good to do a call for volunteers to start the tutorials when the.
Yeah, I will set up a repository. So there's nothing done yet.
No. Yeah. Okay. Good.
But I will put it on my to-do list and see they can get started in the next time.
Then we can advertise it on the newsletter by the end of the month on Twitter and so on. Maybe, and on this course. Yeah, good. And then for Fortran-lang.org, then I think I think would be a good thing to submit to Google Season of Docs. I have no idea what it requires to submit something there, but.
I mean, let's talk about those projects next. If the documentation is finished, so is this still something we have to discuss on the FPM standard lib Fortran-lang web page documentation?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
If it's not the case, then I would say let's move on and talk about our plans for the Google Summer of Code. And maybe also the docs version of this. All right, let me share my screen again. I think I linked all the respective. They have announced their program, and maybe the most important change they opened this program up, so it's not only for students only anymore. Now everybody can become a contributor to GSoC, independently of their current status. And they also changed the program, so there are two kind of extents you can apply for. So there's a medium project and a large project. But other than that, I think it is more or less the same like last year. And if I recall correctly, it's going to start in February. And the application is going to close, I think, 22nd of February. So I think it's about time to start looking for topics, collecting them. We should make an announcement on the discourse and update our wiki. And the other thing which I mentioned is the season of docs, which is, as far as I understood, more or less the same as the summer of code, but not for programmers, but for technical writers. And we would have to apply there as well. So these are two separate things. And also propose projects, which are more in the writing documentation regime rather than in the coding regime. Actually, you can't even submit a project which is entirely documentation to Google Summer of Code. They are not going to accept this. Participating in both projects, of course, means we have more work. We have to prepare everything basically twice, or with different focus. And so at least I think it might be worth it to also apply for a season in code and maybe see if we can get there something. And the other thing I linked was this Outreachy. I saw this that CondaForge has contributed there. And let's see if I can find this. As far as I understood, you can't really apply for this. So I'm a bit unsure whether we actually have a chance for this program. Well, but what I saw from CondaForge, let's see if I find this again. Okay. What I saw from CondaForge, they use this Outreachy program to get technical writers and help to improve and overhaul the complete CondaForge documentation. And this really did a great job. They massively improved over the whole range.
Sebastian, did you say we cannot apply for Outreach?
I looked through the documentation if there's something where we can apply, and it more and more looked to me that this is invite only. I'm not entirely sure yet. Maybe I overlooked something, but apparently there's some form of invitation required. The question is whether we just need to contact the organization which was already involved, and they have to invite us, or if Outreachy itself has to approach us. This is maybe something we have to find out. On the other hand, the application time overlaps with the Google Summer of Code. So applying for 3 things at the same time might be a bit too much. However, the Outreachy is happening twice a year. So when the Google Summer of Code ends, there would be the second chance for participating in this Outreachy. So you might just have an eye on this, figure out whether this is actually something we can apply for or we can participate in. and then plan this for fall this year. To try to participate in this program after we finished our Google Summer of Code season of docs. I don't know.
That sounds good. Question, Sebastian. Regarding this, you can't apply with a documentation project to Google Summer of Code, which makes sense. Do you think we could apply with this, Fortran-lang.org migration as a basic an infrastructure implementation project?
I think this would work. I mean, this doesn't really have to do something with documentation. This is the migration of a framework.
There's coincidentally Sphinx docs.
Yeah. But Sphinx itself is a framework, which is pretty much stands on for its own. So I think this should work.
That seems like a really clear and well-defined potential project. Does anybody have any project ideas off the top of their heads right now?
One I've been thinking about is an official FPM, not registry, but like repository, something like Cargo has, where a package that is released, like a tarball of that release is hosted, and so you don't have to specify a Git repository to make use of some dependency. It's something we've been wanting for FPM since we designed it. The only thing that I have a question about is who's going to pay for the hosting. But it would be a very useful and well-defined project for something like Google Summer of Code, I think, as one of the larger projects.
You mentioned the value being you don't have to specify a Git URL. You just give it a name. But that do you really need a repository for that? I'm thinking if you further extended, say, the FPM search plugin, which currently, you can get the Git URL by a name of the package. If you took it one step further, you could make it so that you only specify name, but you still get the project you get a source from Git. But there gotta be other key value additions. From having a registry.
One of the biggest ones is security. So if you're just using Git as your fetching and dependency management system, it's very easy for somebody to slip malicious code into a repository, and then there's the security issue. With an official like repository for released packages, you can manage that to some extent, right? If I want to publish a release, there's some review process or some approval process that one could go through, right? I could go to all of my current FPM packages and remove all of the Git tags and break everybody's dependencies, right? You can't do that if we have a managed repository. So that's one of the biggest benefits, I think, is.
Will it also make it easier to link to packages that are not on GitHub or something similar?
Yes. Yeah. It also removes the requirement that your package be in a GitHub repository. Right. You could take some SourceForge project and turn it into an FPM package and not have to convert to Git and store it on GitHub.
the drawback I can imagine is that you then effectively take responsibility for such a package. So also responsibility for updates of that.
Mhm. I mean, you know, you could view any GitHub repository that way. It's like there's not necessarily any guarantee that somebody is going to continue to provide maintenance and
No.
updates.
True.
Yeah, I think we need it in the long run, and obviously we have to be responsible as a community for the resources we provide there.
Mhm.
And if we do it right, we can foster quite a good ecosystem growth, and maybe also more trust in FPM.
Yeah, if we have a community managed like official release repository that kind of lends some legitimacy to the project and to any packages that are hosted there.
I think there's a lot to figure out before we can actually go for hosting. So I think I mentioned this last year when we were searching for GSoC projects, that the first step I would take would be implement a local repository, which means that you can create basically your own repository where you give a resource path. And I mean, this can be a file path, but basically it could also be HTTPS or whatever path where you get your registry for and define this format. How are we going to store our packages? And if you can do this locally, then you can also do it on the server. And then we just have to provide a mechanism for FPM to use this. Maybe it's going to mirror the servers. I don't know. So, what the best setup is to make this scale?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate first step and would even more well-defined scope for a Google Summer of Code project. Like figure out how we're going to make this work before we even consider going and finding some hosting service to put it on.
I think regarding projects for Google Summer of Code, we can basically go hunting in the goals for 2022 thread, and basically partition those on standard lib FPM, and maybe I think we'll probably also again participate with Fortran. So we're going to get a lot of projects again, which we can offer. And then we had a lot of people asking for contributions for documentation, and this should give us a good basis to form our projects, which we want for Google Season of Docs. And I would go so far and say we try to get all the people who wanted who added goals to this thread and try them to participate maybe as mentors.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea.
And if not as mentors, maybe even as participants.
Also possible. Now that there's no restriction anymore, basically everybody from the Fortran community could participate over this.
Yeah, they weren't. What was the delineation between who can be a mentor versus who can be a participant now?
I think for the mentor, you have to be familiar enough with the code to actually lead somebody through the project who's not familiar with it and just starting.
Right. So like last year I was a co-mentor, right? But does that mean that now I can't be a participant, or?
I'm actually not sure. As much as I understood, you can be a Google sum of code participant 2 times.
Okay.
I don't know if this excludes. If this goes away if you were a mentor once.
Right. I mean,
I don't know.
I think they're still like encouraging, early career and students to be the participants, and later career and experienced people to be mentors, but they've kind of somewhat made the line a lot blurrier.
We can read the rules that they have now. I'm sure this is a scenario that they anticipated. And even if it's not written, we can just send an email to the mailing list and ask. They're very responsive. I would be surprised that they don't allow that. I mean, to me, it seems like a good option. Just on this previous topic that we discussed about this, the hosting, does some of the benefits, can they be achieved by putting work into FPM registry repo that we have, and maybe doing sort of a recurrent builds of all the packages in the registry through GitHub Actions, or even just having dedicated hosted runners by us? So not necessarily a hosted repository that provides tarballs, but just compute instances that consistently build all the packages, and when new stuff is being added, so that you ensure that at least packages don't break, like in a scenario that you mentioned. Would that be a good GSoC project to like focus on really making FPM registry more robust and more functional?
So one thing we can look into is how Homebrew works. They have the possibility to use a GitHub repository to make a Homebrew tab, basically a channel of packages. And this is all automated via GitHub Actions. And they have a mechanism with a few bots, which you can steer via GitHub Actions, which detect changes. So if you have a repository with multiple packages, it will see which one is changed, will build only those, and it will upload to GitHub tags. So basically, this would be, we could get quite far by exploiting just the GitHub repository, GitHub Actions, and the GitHub releases to build our initial registry without having to host this externally. So this might be very well possible.
Yeah, there's a couple of technical ways to do this. So some exploring the different options is definitely worthwhile.
Great, yes. And I just want to add one idea. I'm curious what you think about this as a dedicated GSoC project, is to have an FPM, how do you call that? Let's say a dedicated FPM converter. Converter is the participant, the person in the GSoC program that basically scours the internet and GitHub, GitLab, and other Git repository for Fortran packages that can be FPMified, and bring them, basically either work with the authors if they're maintained, or basically make a fork like we did with, say, FFTPack and maybe something else, to basically FPMify many great, both legacy and non-legacy stuff, stuff that's actively developed right now, but not an FPM package.
I love the idea. It seems a little open-ended for what a GSoC project might look like, but maybe that's okay. I think that would be awesome if we could find somebody to, start doing something like that.
My hope with that is that if we took Sebastian's chart of FPM packages with time, it will be kind of like a stepwise jump on the graph.
I think this can work great. There are a few issues which we have to consider. Rolling into another project and offering them a new build system can get different receptions. So we have to be really, really careful with this. There are projects which really feel very strongly about their build system they are supporting. So we should be careful with what we're doing. Giving this somebody new could be more difficult. The other point is if we hit a legacy project, just putting FPM on it wouldn't solve anything. What we would have to update this project, maybe add a more modern interface, and most importantly, provide some documentation how to use it. Just say you can use it with FPM won't help anymore.
Well, except the part that you could easily put as a dependency, right? And the user still has, all else equal, you're still stuck with the same docs that you had previously. Of course, modern interfaces, better docs, that would be great. That seems like it would greatly expand the scope of the project. And regarding this open-endedness problem, I agree, and I wonder if something like you could, define a useful and high-quality subset of netlib to FPMify.
Yeah, that would certainly give it a more clear scope if you could do something like that. And netlib would be a great starting point.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Yes, 10 p.m. now here. Should we continue the stuff on GitHub or on Discourse?
Yeah, seems like a good point to wrap up.
Yeah. So yeah, I propose that we close the meeting if there's no other comments that you would like to throw here, and then yeah, we'll meet in 1 month again. Good.
Great. Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
See y'all later.